Welcome to the first ever Follower of One, I Work for Him Ministry webinar. Mike Henry joins us as the Follower of One founder. And Mike has a myriad of marketplace leadership history in positions throughout organizations all over the United States. Mike helps marketplace Christians integrate their faith and daily life. Mike hails from the Tulsa, Oklahoma area. Martha and I join you from the headquarters of I Work for Him in Southwest Missouri. I Work for Him is a connection ministry dedicated to unlocking God's purpose for you and your work. We're grateful that you've joined us this evening and hope that when we complete this conversation a little under an hour from now, you'll be blessed and challenged. Our goal with this webinar series is to tackle topics that the everyday believer at work needs us to tackle. Tonight, we focus on how do we minister? How do we serve people at different levels within our organizations? In other words, how do we serve, or I like to put it, minister? What do we mean by that? We're going to dig through what does serve, minister look like. How do we do this to our coworkers, our employees, our bosses, our clients, our vendors? Sure, Mike and I could have had this conversation in detail, but we decided to bring in some of the marketplace's best experts who are actually practitioners today in executing best practices in this area. Tony Dale is the founder of Point Health, formerly the Caris Group, as well as the founder of Sedera Health. And in the last 2 years, the founder and CEO of Force Cloud Solutions, Salesforce experts empowering business to accelerate growth. Tony joins us from the Austin, Texas area. Bonnie Mock is a certified leadership coach with The Crowning LLC. She's a certified Colson Fellow and a certified Blackaby Ministries International Leadership Coach. We welcome Bonnie Mock from the Phoenix, Scottsdale area. Bonnie Mock and Tony Dale, welcome, along with Mike Henry and Martha Brangenberg. We're glad to have you guys all here tonight.
Hey, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, so as we discuss in the introduction tonight, we want to deal with this basic question. How do we minister to different people based on our position and their position within the organization? Bonnie, I want to start with you, because I think we all deal with a basic understanding of the significance of our workplace. But how do you see your workplace as a place of ministry? Bonnie Mock.
Oh, thank you. I love this question. I love this topic because I got to live it. And let me start by saying I was a pastor's wife. So my whole world was in the church. And then suddenly, 15 years later, it was not. And I was put into a very large corporation, worked with all kinds of people. And I recognized within that very first week, that was my mission field. And before that, I never even thought that your workplace could be your mission field. I was thinking, what am I going to do now? Now I'm out working here in this secular environment. I thought I was made for ministry. And that is actually when ministry really began. So It's really living Christ in the workplace. And I can go into detail later on with your other questions, but that was my awakening was, wait a minute, this is my mission field. My family would actually call me a missionary to where the company I was working. It was mind blowing, and it shouldn't have been, but it was. I loved it.
Tony Dale, what about you? How do you look at your workplace as a place of ministry?
It's interesting that you asked that question from my point of view, immediately following what we've just heard from Bonnie, because I was actually brought up in this environment. My mom and dad, a doctor and nurse, were running a clinic out in Taiwan, and they didn't let anybody call them missionaries. They said, no, we're just doing what every believer should be doing, and that is we're serving Jesus where he's placed us. And so, they were placed within the healthcare sphere. And I grew up in that sort of environment. Subsequently myself becoming a family doctor and getting very involved with, training other family doctors across Britain and then across the world as what it looks like to really view your medical practice as an outpost of the kingdom of God. For me, the concept that it's all the Lord's. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and all who dwell therein. That's what we're all called as Christians to live. So that's how I've tried to live.
Praise God.
Thank you, Tony. What about you, Mike? Mike Henry from Follower of One. Talk to us about your experience as a leader in the marketplace and how you look at your work as a ministry place.
Well, my challenge was always just trying to only live one life. I didn't want to have to live two lives. And so I was trying, when I became a Christian, I was trying to take that with me to work. I was already in the workplace. And it seemed like all the church's answers were for me to leave work and do something. And so I just struggled with that for a number of years, but kept trying things until I came up with different ideas for ways to pay attention to the people around me and ask God to move in their lives in such a way that I got to see him working.
I love that. Martha, you and I really struggled with this idea of our workplace being a ministry place. Why don't you tell a little bit of our story?
Well, it's interesting because it's kind of like you take all of your stories and you stir them in a mixing bowl. And I feel like it's kind of our story. My parents very much integrated their faith into their entrepreneurial lives and into the work that they did. So I had that example. My parents became missionaries overseas for a year doing their craft. So it was very much this idea that their work, God designed them to do it and to do it well, no matter where they were. But Jim and I both thought we had this call to full-time Christian ministry as teenagers. And we thought that that could only mean one thing: to be a pastor or a missionary on a foreign field, or a youth pastor or something like that. And so we were very entrepreneurial. And so feeling that we were shorting God on the very calling that he had given us, yet using the gifts he had given us to be good in business, we always had this tension until we started to get this clearer understanding that our work was given to us by God as our ministry, and that the people we touched was our mission field that we got to go to every day. And we really truly were business as mission in our own entrepreneurial adventures. And so really getting all of those dots connected and seeing how it worked really is our story.
You know, I want to move into the crux of the conversation tonight. Thank you, Martha. Because I want to look at how do we do ministry? How do we serve the following categories: our coworkers, our bosses, and or our board of directors? How do we minister to our employees? And what about our vendors and customers? What does that look like? But I want to ask this question first. No, maybe I'll ask it second. I'll ask it second. Let's just start with coworkers. All right, because we've all had coworkers. Maybe right now we don't have any coworkers because we're at the top of the organization. But what is the best way to serve / minister? Because I believe minister is the same word as serving. What is the best way to serve our coworkers? Mike Henry.
So I think it's just appreciating them, paying attention to them, and looking for ways to help them succeed and flourish in their life. And, maybe just remembering their kids' names and praying for their wives and their spouses, and, looking for ways to help people while we're working.
All right. What about you, Bonnie Mock, serving your coworkers?
Ooh, that was good, Mike. So I have no coworkers at this point since this is my company. However, I'm pulling from the awesome experience I did have. And what it was right along the same lines as Mike there. It is number one, or maybe number two, because abiding in Christ is number one. But number two, recognize that every person you encounter has been put in front of you by God. Because if you believe in his sovereignty and you believe his word where he says that he orders our steps, if you believe in Joshua, when Moses passed away and Joshua was taken over, and the Lord said, every place your foot treads, your soul treads, the sole of your foot treads, is territory I've promised you. So when you go into your workplace with the mindset of this is territory God gave me, this is someone he's given me to encounter, you love them with the love of Christ. You listen to them. You get familiar. That relationship builds. You know them as their families. They open up when they see that you're a safe place. And that is the beginning of where Christ can just begin to just live out of you. And they know you are authentic and you are genuine and you care about them. And that would be the beginning steps.
Tony Dale, it's been a long time since you had coworkers because you've been the president and CEO of your organization for the last, couple of decades. But when you and Felicity worked side by side in your doctor's office way back in the UK a few years ago, how did you see to minister to your coworkers?
Well, I think at one level, there's not going to be a lot of difference between any of our experience. If you're living authentically, if you're being real, then your coworkers, almost more than anybody, already know whether they're seeing Christ in you. I don't think this is something you turn on and off. I mean, since you specifically asked me about back in my medical days, before every what we call the surgery, but I wasn't a surgeon. A surgery in England, in the medical world, is also where a doctor works. So before I would go to my surgery, I would pray before every block of office time that was going to be with patients, and say, Lord, make me alert to who the people are who are coming in today, for whom the only real answer is you.
Oh,
and in all sorts of surprising ways, God would do that. And it could be anything from, we had a 6-week period where we saw someone give their life to Christ every day in the doctor's office, to, the more common experience where it might be, weeks or sometimes months where you felt like there wasn't that much opportunity. And yet all of a sudden God opens something up because you're just seeking to live for him. So from my point of view, the authenticity is absolutely critical. This isn't something we turn on.
Martha, I want you to start the conversation on how do we minister to our bosses? You've had, you worked for a decade within a church as the church bookstore manager. You had lots of bosses there. How did you learn to minister to those bosses?
I think multiple different ways that there's that opportunity. Everything from actually finding out how they are doing. I think the same thing that you apply to your coworker can apply to your boss. See them as more than just an authority figure, but somebody that's a human that's probably struggling inside and doesn't have permission to show that to the person under him or her, and allowing them to be real and praying for them, finding out what they are. Maybe they don't necessarily want to share what their personal struggles are, but maybe they do. And maybe it's a project they're working on that you are helping to assist in, or you're supporting in some way, but realizing the bigger picture that a boss has a different level of stress and responsibility, and being supportive of that and not just taking it for granted. I think it goes a long way for just giving them encouragement that the people around.
Bonnie, what about you? Have you had any bosses that this was a little tougher project?
Wow, I love this because yes, I did. I had personality, different things, and that was a lot of tension. But I will tell you how, if you're living the life, you're living Christ, and continually, how he will actually take those situations and use you. And this one, as Martha was talking there, made me think of one in particular. I watched my my main superior, and he was very nervous because he was kind of walking a line and he didn't know if he was going to be demoted or sent out or what. And I could see this tension, and I knew he had a family. He loved his kids, and he was really tense. And I would pray for him. I'd pray for him at home. I'd pray for him. And it was getting worse and worse. I could see him getting very nervous, staying in his office more often. And I said, I want to pray with him. And I told another believer there in the where I was working, I said, I really want to pray for him. He says, well, he doesn't believe in God. That's irrelevant to me. I really want to pray with him. And she is like around the wall. She's around the corner. You can't go in there. He doesn't believe in God. I said, I have to go in there. And I was so truly compassionate because I cared about him, because I watched him carry this burden. And here's how I said it. I just, I told him, I says, I'm aware of what's going on. And I said, I have been praying for you for weeks. And I know that a decision's about to be made on your behalf. And I'm very concerned about you. And I says, so I want to tell you how I've been praying for you. So this is how I did it, with my eyes open. I'm looking at him and I says, I've been praying that you will come to know God for who he really is, and know that he is someone you can trust, that loves you with a love that you have never been loved with an eternal love. And I have been praying that you will somehow become hungry to get to know who he is. And when you do, you dive in to know him more. I pray that you will know that he's the one who's protecting you. He's going to look after your family, that he's someone that wants you to get to know him. And I don't remember everything I said, but I said it direct, and he had tears coming down his eyes. He was absolutely spellbound, because maybe no one has ever done that. But then I said, I just want you to know that, and I will continue praying for you like that. So I leave. My friend runs into his office and shuts the door. So I don't know what went on there, but I will tell you that he got his report less than a week later, and he was actually promoted into a position he had been wanting for a very long time. And he called me in the office and he told me, he says, "You will not believe this. And instead of getting demoted or moved out, I've actually been moved up, and this is what I wanted, because I could spend more time with my family." I saw God work. I'm not afraid. We walk in the confidence of the Holy Spirit dwelling in us. Never be afraid. Don't go in with arrogance. You go in with humility, but God will give you the words to say. And if you already have compassion, you have already been praying for these coworkers or these bosses or other people, when that time comes, he will, when he says, "Don't be afraid what you're going to say, you just open your mouth and I'll fill it," he will certainly do that. And he will touch that situation, and he'll touch that person, and he'll make himself known in that, and he will be glorified.
That's fantastic. Tony Dale, you've been an owner for a lot of years, and you've been self-employed for a lot of years, but you've got boards of directors that you have to please. And sometimes I imagine there's some contention even on your boards of directors. How do you find yourself ministering to your boards of directors for your multiple different organizations?
The way you describe me, it sounds like I'm some sort of super duper businessman.
Super mogul. That's what we'll call you on tonight's call.
Your listeners need to understand I'm an ordinary family doctor who found himself in God's call, getting involved in all sorts of other things for which I had no training or background, but which God gives you the strength and the grace. So yes, absolutely. I've worked with boards and, also with sort of, as it were, coworkers, but who are themselves the bosses, the leadership teams within the company or within the medical practices that I've run. Again, I think our call is to be who we are all the time. So, I think of one time, relatively recently, when we were going through some pretty significant challenges within Sedera, and our CFO brought up in a meeting, one of the things we do as a company is we actually allocate financial resources to prayer warriors. So that they will be praying for us. We believe that all work is given by God, and those whose call is intercession. We want to actively stand with them and value that in terms of them being members of our staff, not full-time members, but people who this is their call. But the CFO brought up in this sort of management meeting publicly, he said, "Tony, obviously, not all of us see things quite the way you do. But I really don't think we should be spending money this way." I chuckled and I sort of said, I'd be interested to know what other people think. And there were various comments, sort of pro and con. And then I said, well, it's really interesting. But before we would cut these people, we would actually have to cut every one of you and me. Because Jesus has always been at the center of what we do. And if we're not prepared to acknowledge that openly, it's very clear from his word that he may not be willing to acknowledge us openly either. Yeah. And I said, unfortunately, although I know this is a really severe financial situation at the moment, that is not something I would cut. I'd rather that we cut our own salaries, which, I won't sort of go into any of the specifics, but that would be more appropriate at this point in time. Now, God has done extraordinary things. I mean, from that particular story, which is maybe 18 months ago, to where God has put us now, where we've recently gone through a merger, and the value of the company from that time to this has maybe doubled, or maybe more than that. I don't know. That those aren't necessarily things, again, that you need to be too specific about. But there, the context now would be the relationship with the board. And there's a really good book out there by Greer, what's his first name, the head of Hope International, called The Board and the CEO. Or maybe it's the CEO and the board, whichever way. But because I found myself in both positions, I've realized how important it is that your communication with those who are responsible for you, because at that point I was also acting as CEO of the company and not just chairman of the board. And so I was very much under the authority of the board, that we had to be equally open in the board. I remember, over a period of time, I mean, this is just a sort of function of how organizations, they sometimes mature and get more crusty, less authentic, less real. And I felt that, people were asking me maybe to open a meeting in prayer. And so I just deliberately said, I think we basically pray without ceasing all the time. And I'm not very interested in me opening this with some sort of formal prayer. But I said, why don't any of us share a little bit of what's on our heart and what we want God to do? And then God is hearing all of our hearts. And so what you're doing is you're creating a teachable moment where whoever you're working with and wherever they are on their spiritual journey, you're seeking to make it easier for them to open up to the presence of Jesus in what's going on. And so I think that would give you sort of two sides of that, working either with the boss, in that case the board, or with the bosses, the senior people in the company, and helping them understand that, no, we want to keep Jesus not as a religious figure, but as our close friend and confidant in whatever is going on.
Right. Mike, have you ever had a boss that was hard to minister to?
Maybe. I'd like to hear your answer. So you've been doing all the question asking.
That's what I do best. I do have a great story. Back in the mid 2000s, I was working for a large construction company, and that was when God really woke up I work for him in my life, and I learned that my workplace really mattered to God. And I started praying on my 90-mile commute each way to work. I started praying for my bosses and their spouses and their children. And I had 4 bosses, all of which operated in different levels within the organization. It was a huge development construction company. And my one boss that I dealt with, I had 2 bosses I dealt with the most. And one of them, we were on a road trip. We had talked about Christ a lot. And we were flying on a plane to go fire somebody in another state. And we're on this plane and we argued about, she said, I don't know a problem with God. Jesus, he's so exclusive. I'm just not sure about Jesus. And we got off the plane and we got in a rental car and we're heading down a freeway that many of you would know, right near a huge truck stop that many of you have known in a famous Midwestern area. And we came up on over a hill and the traffic was stopped. And it had been snowing lightly and I slammed on the brakes. I couldn't stop the car. And we were heading for the rear end of a semi truck. Couldn't stop the car. Somehow, by the grace of God, he allowed me to steer under the shoulder because I'd never slowed down because it was on ice. I didn't know it was that icy. But when we got on the shoulder, we still couldn't stop. 300 feet we skidded on the shoulder. We finally came to a stop. And then I see a semi truck with 9 full-size pickup trucks coming right behind us doing exactly the same thing. And he takes the ditch to save our lives. And he ends up in front of us on the shoulder of this freeway. And I looked at her, I said, listen, if I'd have stopped that car, we'd be dead. I said, but God's not done with you yet. And you're not ready to die. If I'd have died, I'd have been good, but you weren't ready to die. Wow. We had a conversation for 2 hours on the airplane. And literally, I watched our lives go before us. She, within a couple of months, surrendered her life to Christ. One of my other bosses, who I'd been praying for a very long time, recommitted his life to Christ. And both of them today, walking with the Lord in new life. I had 2 other bosses in the same organization. One of them stole tens of millions of dollars. I don't know where he is at today, but I still pray for him every once in a while. And my other boss still seeking, but not surrendering. So I've had lots of different experiences. That was perhaps the most privileged one I ever had, was to have that conversation in sheer terror and then sheer emotion when I looked at her and go, we just could have died.
Very
So
cool.
I want to move on to employees, because it's a little touchier subject when you have employees. And Bonnie, I honestly don't know if you've ever had employees. I apologize. I should have asked that question offline ahead of time. But minister employees, it's touchier because we have all these rules in this country that, you can't force your faith on somebody. So is there a specific way that is effective yet respectful to minister to employees? Martha, I watched you as an employer of over 17 in a bookstore. How did you see your ministry to those employees? What did you do? How did you best minister to them?
I took it. I had an interesting staff. I was often the very first employer that most of my employees ever had. And so I carried this mantle, if you will, that I wanted to set them up for raising the bar pretty high for their workplace experience. And so really getting to know them, really getting to feed into them. I saw my ministry as really walking alongside them as they become an employee and helping them to become the best employee that they can become. Telling them, I know I'm not going to be your last employer. Like, this is not a career path. I was in Christian retail, part-time job, so there was no potential for it to be full-time for others. So I knew I was a pass-through. So I wanted to be the very best experience they could have to set them up to be a good employee for the next person. And so I did a lot of communicating. I did a lot of reviewing. I had an open door policy. I really tried to practice things audibly with them so that they didn't have this experience of, I'm afraid of my boss. I'm afraid I'm doing something wrong. I don't know where I stand. I don't know if I'm doing a good job. I didn't want any of that to be in their mind. And so I pray that was the role I took very seriously, helped launch them for their careers. And so that's really how I saw the best way I could minister to them, pray with them, when they're young teenagers having stressful things happening in life and so on, just really trying to be a real person in their life and not just an authority figure.
Bonnie Mock, have you ever had employees?
I have had people work under me when I was put in management. Yes. And
so how did you see your role as a manager to be a minister, and how did you specifically minister to those people?
Well, I really wanted them to excel in their skill. I was a florist, and I remember I had a woman who was about 20 years older than me. She had retired, and she had always dreamed of working in a flower shop. So I turned away from her. I gave her what she would need, and I turned away because I didn't want to micromanage her. I wanted her to see what she could do, because she had not been allowed under another piece of leadership, another leader, to do that. She was doing the grunt work. But I knew she had this desire. So what I was doing was hopefully showing her the love of Christ in allowing her to just go ahead and be free to do this. I literally wouldn't look because I know I would have been nitpicky. She had such a good time and she enjoyed it so much. So the things that were not required to have that she could just do custom, I'd let her do those. She ended up being my top designer for the Valentine holiday. And she knew I was a believer, and it's the grace of God. I saw this woman excel in something she had wanted to do, but had been stifled and limited and unable to do that. But in other places where I was raised, I was moved into a different location, and a boss was removed and I was put in that place. And the person under me was very angry about that and worked for 4 months to destroy me. And I had prayed and prayed and prayed over her. Eventually, I was told from the corporate level to leave there because they felt this was harassment that I could actually report, but I didn't. But I want to tell you, when you're praying for somebody we're told to pray for those who persecute us and do all manner of evil against us. God knows why he's telling us that. And our faith will grow. We will trust God more. And yes, it was hard. It was the hardest 4 months I had ever worked. but I truly cared about her. I truly prayed over her. I gave her a Bible, I gave her books, I prayed with her about her kids. And one day, several years later, I got a call from her that she was cleaning out her drawers and she found these things. She says, I've wanted to ask you to forgive me for years. I've been scared to death. And then I realized, why would I be afraid? You're a real Christian and you'll forgive me. And I told her, I says, I forgave you years ago. And let me tell you, while I was going through my cancer journey, her daughter was going through a cancer journey. And simultaneously, I had the opportunity to pray with her and pray with her daughter. Had I not forgiven her and held bitterness back then, do you think God would have let me minister to her years later?
Right.
So stick to it. Stay obedient.
Mike, what about you? You've had employees in the past through some of your positions, and today you run a team. How do you specifically minister to those employees?
Well, there's the way I did it some, which wasn't so good. And then there's what I've learned. I think the best thing that I could do is just try and remember what's best for them. And oftentimes I find that I do better with people who have a vision for their job. They want to do something with their job and they're not, I did some work in some industries where some of the employees felt like they were taking something from the company, or it was this kind of scarcity mindset where if they worked too hard, they were losing. And those situations I found out were just very difficult for me. I was better off out of them just because there are limits to my abilities. And, but for people who wanted to kind of succeed, then I was always trying to help them succeed. I believe that if you make the employees successful, then eventually, if you do that well, then you make the business successful, or the employee becomes successful at the company's expense. And that's not a good job. That's a management fail. So we have to make changes in those situations. But I spent most of my energy praying for people and trying to figure out how to help them, make the most out of their career and get the most value out of their own energy so that they could succeed.
It's so important when we see people as a gift from God when they're working for us, and to recognize God's creative hand as he built them in their mother's womb at the beginning of their life. And so I love that conversation. Tony Dale, you operate a company where Martha and I have been on your campuses multiple times and seen the level of intentionality of, you have people working for you that know Jesus and people that don't. You have people that you have entrusted the leadership of your organizations to make sure they pass on your vision for really loving your employees, providing a great place for them to work, and of course, to do great work in what they do. What are some of the things that you do with a high level of intentionality that ministers to your employees, whether they believe in Jesus or not?
That's a really good question. And I'm not sure necessarily how effective we are, but I think the intentionality you're describing is really important. So let me first of all go back and give an example with the patients, because when I was working, in clinical medicine, obviously there are a lot of professional sort of ethical issues about sharing your faith coming from a position of power and authority over the patient, that type of thing. And, people perhaps being offended with the idea that doctors would share with their patients. And one of the things I realized early on was we have to make it really easy for people to say they want help. So let me give you an example. I would often say to a patient, in a context where maybe we're dealing with, some sort of very difficult issue, perhaps intractable pain or something like that, I'd first of all put the blame on myself. So I'd say, I wish there was more we could do to help you in this situation. And I'd see, and they would appreciate, they'd probably say something, thank you, doctor. And then I'd say a very gentle sort of door opener, which was a way for them to give permission if they wanted to, or not give permission if they didn't want to. So I'd say something along the line of, in something like this where our medical answers aren't very good, have you ever thought about praying about this?
Mm.
And the typical answer I got, most of my medical work was in the East End of London, working with a very sort of working class type of blue collar worker. And the typical answer was, "Oh, doctor, I pray, but I don't know if anyone hears me." And all of a sudden, they've opened the door. And you found a non-threatening way to say, if you want us to talk in these areas, I'm open to talking about it. And so I'd say it's very, very similar when you're dealing with employees. Yes, I think we do need to be very respectful. And, the employee isn't looking for a boss who's sort of a Bible basher or whatever. They're trying to provide you a good service in the work that you're doing. But they have all sorts of needs and challenges. And so in the same way, I would typically, as I sense that there was something going on with an employee that really we needed to open up, if you like, to some of the reality of what's going on at the heart level, I would find, something out of my own life where I could say, I've been in this sort of situation. I might tell them a situation when I was in a hospital and it was going bad or whatever it was. And then, would you be interested to know how God helped me when I was struggling with that? And that way, again, you're finding whether there's permission to open up about your own sort of inner dealings with God. And it's far easier to people to identify with your weaknesses than with your strength.
Yes.
And as the doctor or as the boss in the company, I've always been like the one who's been on a pedestal. And if you can deliberately get off that pedestal and become someone incredibly ordinary, that makes it so easy then for people to begin to open up to you.
Great words. I want to ask this final question. The whole point of any business is to have customers and any organization. I mean, customers may be attendees to webinars like tonight or whatever, but tonight's free gimme to all of you, but you're our customers. But we also have vendors because if we're selling something, we have to buy something in order to resell, or we're getting supplies of some sort to run any kind of organization. Is there room in the operation of any organization to minister to to vendors or to customers? Is that appropriate, inappropriate? Mike, why don't you start us off there?
Yeah, well, it's just by being a great provider or being a great customer of a vendor. What's creating win-win is
what's that look like to be a great customer? What's it look like for you to be a great customer of a vendor?
Trying to create win-win, be very honest, be very open, talk about exactly what it is you're trying to accomplish, be praying for them and looking for ways to help them be successful. For me, I'm trying to help them be successful by making us successful. For a vendor or for a customer, I'm trying to help them be successful and also benefit our organization. There's no scarcity in this where me selling them something means they lose and we win or vice versa. We're trying to create these win-win environments. The guy who created the idea of win-win is the one that we worship. Mm-hmm. He's the one who created this model where we follow him and everything works out. Mm-hmm. And so I'm looking for win-win in all these relationships and ways to be a help and ways to appreciate, remembering details, being available to speak, asking permission sometimes, like Tony said, when someone asks me a question or they make a comment and it's like my turn to give an opinion, I will point out that my opinion actually comes from the Bible. Are you open to hearing that? Mm-hmm. Those are all opportunities where we get these chances to help people see our motives and then realize that our life is based on a totally different model. And
but Mike, so I can understand that we're ministering to vendors and customers like that. How important is it that we pay our vendors on time in order for that ministry to continue?
Well, that's exactly key. I mean, all those little things are all necessary. We have to pay well and we have to pay on time. I try and pay early. I mean, in the end, this is Jesus's money. And so I'm want to ask him what he wants me to do with it, but it can't ever be pay people late or withhold things or treat them in such a way where we're adversaries. I have to do what's best. Sometimes I may have to stop doing business with them because it's no longer working for us. But I've got to do that in a godly way. I've got to do that in a way that reflects well on my faith and who I follow.
What I find amazing is I have a couple of vendor relationships that were super powerful in my career. One in a large insurance agency that I placed a lot of business with, and a large IT company that I eventually went to help work with and grow in Tampa Bay. And relationships within those vendors turned into lifelong friendships, people that I still contact today, 20 years after the fact of them being a vendor. But it was because you spent so much time with them, buying things from them, and in relationship, the opportunity came many times to pray with people. And that really opens up the doors when you're, as a customer, are ministering to your vendors. I've just have seen it so many times. Bonnie Mock, dealing with vendors or with customers that you were working in the floor shop, you're dealing with all kinds of vendors supplying you all kinds of things that you're using to then resell. How important is it ministry to customers or to vendors to you?
It would be the same thing along every line of area of working. But here's the part with the customer and vendor thing is believing in what you are doing, that God's called you to do that. He's gifted you. So it's a selfless thing. As far as wanting someone to purchase your product, you have to be very selfless and want them to be improved by purchasing your product. That'll go along with any line of sales. None of us wants to be sold something because it's going to benefit the seller. You want to be sold something because it's something you need. And people can tell if you're really listening. You got to listen when people are talking, and you don't be afraid to say, I'll back up this product that we have, but I think that you might be better served with this product, and be selfless. God will bless that. Don't be afraid. Don't be greedy. Be generous in all ways that you work, even if it means you give them over to even a competitor because you feel they can fill that need better. That's authentic. To me, that's authentic Christian sales and Christian just working in that environment. It's selfless. We are to live selfless in every area. And people recognize that's part of the authenticity. It's part of being genuine. It's others focused. Sorry.
No, it's fine. You paused. I jumped in there, of course, because that's empty space. Tony Dale, you've got all kinds of vendors and customers, depending on your business that we talk about. How do you see your role as CEO and founder in those relationships with some of those significant vendors and customers? Have you found yourself having the opportunity to minister within those relationships?
If we're listening to the Holy Spirit, there's always going to be opportunity. I don't mean by that every conversation has to have opportunity. I just mean God is going to create opportunities where you had no idea there were any. I loved what Bonnie just shared. It reminds me of Miracle on 34th Street, where I guess Macy's was sending them, Father Christmas was sending them to, the store down the street. There are all sorts of ways that we can treat vendors with real dignity. And I guess because of the sort of work I've done with patients and, the way the Lord's dealt with me, I've always been very aware that our vendors have needs just like we do. And so those will come up and bubble to the surface at times when you might least expect it. You asking this question has made me think of a time where I was talking with someone who's, very effective in sales and was looking to bring us a new sort of package to work in some of our sales areas. And but he wasn't his normal self. And I just said something to him to that effect, that he didn't seem very happy. And he immediately began opening up about what was going on with him and his wife and the challenges. And literally, he was in tears. Now, I think what that implies was that there had already been a safe environment created where that didn't seem weird or strange to him. He knew that he wasn't just a salesman selling something to us, but he was a person who was important to me. And I think that comes back to, what I've heard one way or another right throughout this talk, which is if we're authentic, open, real, you'll find the Holy Spirit prompting you, and there will always be opportunities.
But Martha, in retail, where most of your customers were church-going people, did you ever have a customer that was just a little hard to minister to?
Oh my goodness, yes. I remember actually when we had our chain of insurance agencies, Jim, you back then I would often have very unhappy customers, mostly because they didn't pay their bill and they got themselves into an issue with being past due, and they take out their frustration on the person on the phone. And I remember you telling me that I didn't first of all, try not to take it personal, but I do because I care about everybody. But also that people didn't have permission to talk to me in a nasty way. And so I kind of went in with a little bit of backbone about that, because people, when they're unhappy, they're going to take it out on people. But one of the things I kind of always have had in the back of my mind is when I'm working with someone, especially in customer service, I want to leave them in such a way that if they showed up at a Christmas party that I was at, that I'd be okay seeing them face to face. That I've resolved it in a healthy enough manner that I wouldn't be wanting to leave the party or go to the other side of the building or whatever to avoid that person because it had ended up not good. So coming to realizing that people, sometimes they take their frustrations out on the people that they can walk away from, after the event, and they're frustrated about something that doesn't have to do with you. So I would just try to honor the process and love on them, even if they were wrong and I had to correct them, but be able to see them again and invite them back as a customer again, without alienating that situation.
One of the greatest ministry lines, Martha, you ever gave me was hurting people hurt people. And when you see people who are hurting people around them, you realize that they're hurting. And as I've said many times in the last several days, well, in each one of us, we're like onions, or we're like ogres. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. We're all like Shrek in some sort of way. And deep inside those layers is hurt that we've wrapped around those layers in order to provide just denial. But sometimes that comes out in incidences, and that's an incredible opportunity for us to do ministry. I want to get a little controversial or challenging in our next question as we start wrapping up here. Just 13 minutes to go. Is there a different tact that needs to be employed when an employee, boss, coworker, vendor, or customer clearly lives counter to the Bible? Is there something different that we need to do in our approach to ministering to them? Bonnie Mock.
You continue to be consistently Christ, because I've had those bosses where their life would be completely on the other world of my beliefs and convictions. But see, if we're called to go into that working place and we're called to be light and salt, it is to live out the teachings of Christ, live out the principle, live out integrity, live out excellence, live out patience and compassion. You must be consistent. It has to be real. It starts, your relationship with Christ and abiding in the vine daily, every morning before you even set foot into what sometimes is a war zone. So yes, you would be consistent. And I have seen that happen, and I have seen God work, and I have seen God soften hearts. And I've seen God not, if he didn't soften hearts, at least what he did was he made it workable for us to stay in that working relationship. And it's, and I would say walking in forgiveness is key, because we can be so easily offended. We get offended by our superiors. We get offended by the people who are not producing for us. And we know we're going to be held accountable for numbers and all of that. And yet they're not producing. You can get bitter or unforgiving. Think about just in your own life and relationships. You expect people you want people to first ask for forgiveness. No, walk in forgiveness.
Hmm,
Let
good
God
words,
deal
Bonnie.
with it. So that's my point.
Mike, what about you? What do we need to do? Is there a different tack that we need to take when a boss or somebody that we work with clearly lives contrary to the Bible?
So I really don't think there's a different tack necessarily. Bonnie's right about remembering to begin with forgiveness. I also have to kind of remind myself that people who don't follow Jesus, they don't have the same values, so they don't
Right.
make the same choices I would make. And they're free to make those choices. And my job is to choose what I'm supposed to do in response to that. But always the Jesus answer is forgiving them, turning the other cheek. I don't want to be offendable. I want to be the person that Jesus has me coming back in there again tomorrow. Tomorrow I have to come to work here again. And so these people ought to, hopefully they know that I'm not playing, but at the same time, I'm there for their well-being and their success.
Let's just say, Mike, they get personal and they get under your skin. They've succeeded in causing you to respond in an inappropriate fashion. What's your response tomorrow morning when you have a chance
to ask forgiveness, to go back in and admit to what I'm wrong? I'm responsible for my side of every one of these transactions, and no one else gets the blame for what I chose to do.
And how powerful is that, asking for forgiveness of somebody who was clearly wrong and they started it? How powerful is that, asking for forgiveness?
I think it's exactly what Jesus would have us do. Whether or not we see results from that power, that's up to him.
That's right.
Tony, Dale, you work with all kinds of people in all kinds of situations. What is there a different tact that you take when you are dealing with people who clearly live opposite of the Bible, what the Bible would show as a great way of life?
Well, I think the starting place for me is kind of an attitude, and that is recognizing that sinners sin. There shouldn't be any surprise about that. As I think it was Mike who said, they start from a different vantage point. They have a different value system. And it may not be a name of Jesus that we tend to exalt very much, but he actually was called a friend of sinners. And so I think part of the call here to us is in a context where.
And Tony cuts out right in the middle of a great conversation. Sorry, Tony Dale. I'm assuming that it got really cold there in Austin, Texas, and that's why you froze up. I want to go on to another final. I really want to open up the conversation. Tony, we lost you there for a minute, so we're gonna have to move on. But it was a great point. Basically, what you're saying is that we got to stop expecting people who don't believe in Jesus to act like people who believe in Jesus, but to make sure our responses are Christ-like responses. And if we screw up, like Mike said, just to ask for forgiveness. All right, I want to open up. Are there any questions from the audience that you'd like us to address before we close out? We've got 7 minutes before we're done. We want to give you a chance, before we give everybody a chance to close out their thoughts of the evening. Is there anybody out there in the audience that has a question that you'd like our panel to answer? You can click on the question and answer button and pop one in there if you'd like. And if there's one, we'll deal with it. Anybody else have any comments on, dealing with somebody who is counter? Martha, have you had that issue where you had somebody you're working with that their life just looks so different than Jesus? And was there a different tack that you took in order to keep him a friend, not alienate him, have an argument? What did you do?
All I can think about is like when we would diffuse people that were having problems with insurance, and really just loving them through the process and trying to get them to change, not necessarily the way they live, but in that moment to take a deep breath. The things that I would want somebody to say to me if I was upset or stressed or feel like I was in crisis, maybe I'd had a car accident, and just say, is there anything that I can do to help you feel better about this situation? And really just trying to diffuse them with the love of Jesus. We don't always have to start with that, but they can see it in us. And just loving them in spite of their actions and helping them through it. And hopefully in that process, helping them to see a good model of something that they've maybe never have experienced before.
Very good. Jessica Fletcher puts this question out there for all of us. How do you respond to someone who continually attacks your work and your ethics? And is there ever a time when you should smack somebody upside the head? No, that's not what she said. And is there ever a time when you should walk away? Tony Dale, start with that one. How do you respond to someone who continually attacks your work and your ethics? And is there ever a time when you should just walk away?
Well, I think there's a very clear answer to that question. If you go to Luke 10, when Jesus sent his disciples out, he says, you're looking for the person of peace. And, you know, when you go into someone's home or workplace or into their sphere of influence, you're looking to see, is there a responsiveness? And if their response is, you know, get the hell out of here, Jesus actually says you have a responsibility yourself to wipe the dust off your feet and move on. So, you know, how we do that, what the context of that looks like, you know, that would be a separate sort of discussion. But absolutely, we're there for those who are ready to hear the great position.
Yeah, and it's important
If they're not looking, then don't pretend you have the answer.
And making sure that we don't throw the javelin at their heart when we walk away, because that really won't accomplish anything. So I guess I want to answer this question. How do you respond to someone who continually attacks your work and your ethics? You know, I've been accused of being a liar. And here's the deal. If you always operate in truth and somebody accuses you of being a liar, guess what? They can't pin anything on you, because if you're always telling the truth, nobody's going to believe that you lied. And they may just be attacking you because normally when people attack you, they're attacking you for what they feel guilty of most. So if they're accusing you of lying, usually that's because that's what they do. But it is difficult not to be defensive. I will tell you that, because if there's one thing that sends me off the deep end, it's when somebody calls me a liar, because I'm not a liar. I'm going to tell the truth. Sometimes I need to be a little more grace-filled with my truth, but I'm not a liar. And Mike, what about you? How do you respond to someone who continually attacks your work and your ethics?
Well, I think you continue to pray for them. You start looking for ways to create a leverage. One idea I just got while Tony was talking was, you know, maybe you need to draw the line and say, and tell your leadership or tell whoever's involved that if they're right, then I must be wrong. I guess I need to go do something else. You know, which one of us do you want to leave? And, you know, to ask that question, because if they don't give you any ability to create a win-win environment, then I think you have to either draw the line or leave. One of my last jobs, I had some employees who interpreted everything I did as being directed at them and being negative toward them. And their reports were negative about me. And it ended up that I got asked to leave. And the lesson that I learned was I should have quit. I should have left there before, instead of trying to persist through all that tension. And, you know, because that was a no-win situation. Like Tony said, I was continuing to show up at this place where I wasn't welcome. And so, you know, I needed to make a change. And eventually my employer made the change. And so I trust God and all that. And got up the next morning and did the next thing.
God freed your future and set you on a path towards followerofone.org. Bonnie Mock, is there ever a time you should walk away?
I would say this, that God always makes a way of escape. And every trial, there's something we're going to grow through. So what I did, because that 4 months was really, really brutal for me, I sought God continually. What am I to gain? What am I to not gain? What am I to learn through this? And I hung on to his leading, and he eventually, in one phone call, removed me. Now, I'm not saying that that's how everyone should do it, but that's what he called me to do. And then I saw the rewards and the gifting of this woman later on connecting with me, and I was able to minister. But so for the most part, I would just say follow the leading of the Holy Spirit, and he always makes a way of escape. That's a promise he's given us. So
Very powerful. All right. As we close out this evening, I'd like one sentence answers to this question. What is a final word of encouragement you'd like to leave with our audience tonight about how do they set forth in really executing ministry in their workplace? One sentence. Mike Henry.
So just putting other people first, trusting God that he's put you there to make a difference in the lives of the people that you interact with every day, and asking him, I talk about, here I am, punch in. Now, what do you want me to do, Jesus?
Tony Dale. When Tony gets unfrozen, we'll go back to him. Bonnie Mock, final sentence. One, a word of encouragement to our audience.
Word of encouragement. We are called the sent out ones. Let's be Christ where he has sent us.
Martha.
Love those around you. They are your neighbors. And that is the commandment that we've been given.
Praise God.
Your workplace is your mission field. And in that mission field, you and me, we may be the only Jesus our coworkers and employees and bosses, vendors, and customers may ever meet. I want to thank you all for being with us tonight. We're honored to just deal with this conversation. If you'd like to have further conversations with us, you could certainly email me at jim@iworkforhim.com, jim@iwork4him.com, or email Mike Henry at mike@followerofone.org. Good night.
Thank you.